What's up, guys? Now let's talk about the different business considerations when talking about APIs. Let's talk about the different business models for APIs. We'll also talk about the different performance indicators when dealing with our APIs. Let's get into it. So, what is the role of APIs in modern business strategy? So, when APIs are in the planning process, business use cases should be considered the priority, right? Organizations that skip this might realize there's no need to be met, there's no reason to make the API. Goals can be driven by revenue, new market routes, new products. All these must be well defined beforehand so they all add up to the right goals, right? You don't want to just make an API and no one uses it, right? Then you just wasted a bunch of money and time. So here are some business use cases. So we want to monetize existing assets. So just like renting a room out in your house to help pay for the electricity and mortgage, you can expose tech assets to the world and get a return on investment through the APIs. So for example, IBM selling access to Watson for data analytics. And also another business use case is connecting business domains. So, say we have interactions across multiple lines of business, we can share data to smooth out some of these processes. So, for example, cloud and on site data centers, like in a company, we have cloud and on site data centers, and we'll use APIs to secure and control the data flow between these components. Also, self service. So we have potential clients, they can learn about the features and services at any time and integrate them into their systems. So they need to be able to integrate them quickly. So you need to make sure that, they have the right documentation and it's easy for them to do that, right? Also innovation. So you can become a simple point of access to talented developers. So for example, Google made an API for Google Maps, and now Uber, Lyft, and other ride sharing apps rely on it. And automation, right? So you can reduce the need for manual processes and scripts, right? So basically, say you have an application and, what it does is it, takes a spreadsheet and it does some kind of script on it, saving, hours of time that some accountant used to do, right? Now they can just make a simple API request and get all that work done. And it allows for higher business efficiency, faster rollouts, reliability, and it can help businesses save funds and resources in the long run. So, what are the different API business models? So, API providers, before we get into this, let's talk about like the value chain, right? So API providers make business assets available to customers, consumers or customers as an API. And then API consumers are the developers using the API under the agreed upon terms and conditions, and they use the API to provide a service to their end user. Now, the end users or customers, they don't see the API, but they benefit from it through the application that they're using. So here are the different API business models. So one is free. So it follows some kind of business purpose. So for example, social logins through Google or Facebook, there's some rate limiting to get users on the premium plan, right? So they can use the API for free, but if they want premium access to better functionality, they can pay for it. Another example is developer pays. So developers using the API must pay through a subscription to use the API. So in this case, it's better to create a sandbox where the developer can use the API's different features. And sometimes the primary features are free, but more premium features will be paid, right? There's also pay as you go. So like a usage-based model. So it's priced based on how much you use the API or how many calls you make. And, for example, AWS, they'll charge you based on how much you use their services. And this can be challenging for the provider to bill properly. For example, AWS bills monthly based on your usage. And then you have transaction fees. So, for example, Visa, MasterCard, they'll charge a small fee of the transaction being completed. The last example is the developer gets paid, right? So, say you have ads. So, the developer gets paid to include the advertisements in their application. So, say you have an API. If you include that API in your system, that API will give you ads that is shown in your application, and you get paid as the developer get paid. For example, like an affiliate is Google AdSense. So, what are the different performance measures in terms of the business when dealing with an API, right? So, the performance of the API, stakeholders need to be on the same page, right? People using the API, people developing the API, what are those measures, right? So, first we have service level indicators, which we'll talk about, service level objectives, and service level agreements. And these are tools that provide developers, business managers, and other stakeholders with metrics that drive business decisions in their products, right? If a certain API is too slow to include in our application, we'll go with a different one, right? So what is a service level indicator? The service level indicator is the quantitative measure of an aspect of the level of service that has been provided. So, for example, examples of service level indicators are the request latency. So how long does it take to return a response? The error rate, the system throughput, the rate at which a system processes and completes tasks, the availability, the fraction of a time when the service is usable, durability, the likelihood that the data will be retained over time. So these are all indicators of our level of service, right? They're just like, so a service level indicator would be the latency or the system throughput, right? Now let's talk a little bit more about specifics. Like when you have a service level indicator, we need to define some metrics or bounds that this service level indicator can be within. So that's where our service level objective comes in, right? So our service level objective is the target range of value for a service we measure through an SLI, right? So say we're talking about latency. Here we have our lower bound and our upper bound, right? So we need to define these. What is our lower bound? What's our higher bound for a specific SLI, right? For example, Google search. So search latency needs to be lower, or it needs to like not exceed 100 milliseconds, right? So that's like our SLO for Google search. Or the response time of 95% of API calls needs to be less than 500 milliseconds. Or the availability of a specific API is around 98%, right? That's our service level objective, right? And that's like on top of our service level indicator, right? So choosing the right service level indicators. So choosing the right SLOs has implications for the product and business, right? You need supervision from the developer and the business stakeholders, right? And you need to keep it simple, right? Complicated SLIs and SLOs are harder to explain and understand. Like these might cause issues with implementation, right? If you're setting if you're coming up with like, okay, we need to have, really good consistency, like 98% consistent, and your business stakeholder is saying like, why do we really need this? Then it's probably not needed, right? And you need to keep it simple, right? So always choose fewer SLOs. Don't choose more SLOs than we need for the coverage of our system. If we can't convince someone of an SLO's existence, then it's best to forget about it, or it'll bog down our development, right? And we always want to avoid absolutes, right? Saying it's highly available and not always available, since the latter is really unrealistic, right? So SLAs, the service level agreement, this is the contract that outlines a service's terms and conditions, right? This is where we say what our SLIs are, what our SLOs are, and if these aren't met, then there'll be some kind of monetary compensation, right? Or service credits or some kind of termination clause, right? So if the API is not meeting your requirements, then you can get there are consequences to that as the developers, right? And this provides the service's availability and performance and other features that customers can anticipate from the service. So customers can learn what to expect from the service from this. And it'll also provide metrics and methods for measuring the performance, like the uptime, response time, throughput, errors. It also provides remedies and consequences if the service fails to meet these agreements. And this should really have the customer experience as the primary focus to ensure their satisfaction, right? So let's just summarize. So we analyzed in this video, we analyzed the impact of APIs on modern business and why they're integral to transforming businesses. We also discussed API providers, different business models to monetize their products, and we also learned how to evaluate our API's performance and provide metrics that are useful for all the involved parties. So let's do a quick quiz. Which model is referred to as the developer gets paid? Right? So we have subscription, transaction fees, and affiliate, right? So in subscription, obviously you're paying the developer or you're paying whoever owns the API, right? Transaction fees is where whoever owns the API takes a fraction of the transactions that's being processed. But with affiliate, this is where you as a developer using the API can use like the ads that they give you and you can get paid for using it, right? That's why the answer is C. And question number 2, which option is cheaper for developers but might be more challenging to bill for the API provider? So you have subscription as pay as you go. Well, in subscription, you just pay like a one-time fee. Like every month, I pay YouTube Red $10, right? It's pretty easy for them to just collect $10 to say, hey, you owe $10. It's just a flat fee every month, right? But pay as you go is a little bit more complicated because then you need to track how much the user is using your APIs. You need to come up with their usage in like a lot of different areas. So that's why the answer is B. So hopefully you learned something. Thanks a lot. And if you have any suggestions, leave a comment. Thanks.